There's a political power play on in Sri Lanka. Under pressure at home and abroad, the president, Maithripala Sirisena, earlier telling diplomats that he'd moved up to next Monday, the date for Parliament, to confirm his shock sacking of Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and his replacement by longtime strongman Mahinda Rajapaksa. The head of his party reversing the change in that calendar, but that's been since denied. There's confusion, which means Sri Lanka continues to have dueling prime ministers. We're going to look into the cause and the legality of the recall. Outside players watching closely, in particular China, which was close to Rajapaksa during his decade in power. That special relationship, which included big loans to Sri Lanka, raised the hackles of an India that's wary of encirclement by its regional rival. More fundamentally, it's a real test for Sri Lanka's democracy. It was on Rajapaksa's watch that a civil war ended with the effective crushing of Tamil Tiger rebels in the north. Reconciliation has been at best slow and timid. Could the turmoil in Colombo reopen wounds that are still raw? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the showdown in Sri Lanka. And joining us from Colombo, Rear Admiral Mahinda Rajapaksa, former governor of Eastern Province. Thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate. Also joining us from Washington, Bharat Gopal Aswani, director of the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Here in the studio, we're joined by Dylan Madhavan of the Paris-based Center for Studies on India and South Asia. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Is the president backing down after pushing back the convening of Parliament to the 16th? The date moved up to next Monday. Then the French news agency quoted a senior official inside of the president's party as saying, no, in fact, the date of the 16th still stands. And now we're getting contradictory word from the Prime Minister-elect, quoted by the Associated Press. Maybe you can help us, Mahinda Rajapaksa, to clear this up. When is Parliament convening, you think?
I think as it is now, Parliament will convene on the 16th of November as originally prorogued, and there is no change to that.
Even though we had those remarks by the president to diplomats, and according to the prime minister, that he has decided to summon the parliament on the 5th now, in fact.
No, I think he has been misquoted because it was at a time of a meeting where he was told over the phone that there's a possibility that it will be advanced to 5th, but that was not confirmed, neither gazetted, because if you are going to re-summon the parliament after proroguing it, you have to make a proclamation, and there's no proclamation which has been done yet.
Is this legal? There was a change in the Constitution in 2015. Can the president just sack the prime minister and replace him with someone else?
Yes, it's absolutely legal because when the president and the prime minister jointly formed a national government after January 2015, after the loss of Prime Minister Rajapaksa, they continued as a national government after the general elections. And when, as per the constitution, I can give you all the articles, when one party relinquishes it or pulls out, automatically cabinet gets dissolved. And as per the regulations, article 48(1), when the cabinet gets dissolved, the prime minister automatically gets dislodged. That's the situation.
All right, let me cross to London and Alan Keenan, who's the Sri Lanka project director at Crisis Group. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. We just heard there Mahinda Rajapaksa saying that for him this is legal, the sacking of the PM and his replacement. Do you agree?
Well, I just came in a bit late. I just heard the tail end of his argument, but I did hear the simple answer is no. I did hear him say that would make this claim that Sirisena made initially, that once one part of a national government pulls out, that the cabinet of ministers is automatically dissolved, and with that, the Prime Minister's seat is vacant. That's an argument that few others than those closely aligned with Sirisena think has any basis in the Constitution. And there have been multiple essays written in the last week, voluminously debunking this. Now, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but the case that this is unconstitutional, I think, is overwhelming to any objective observer.
What's it all about?
Well, I mean, it's about power. It's about Sirisena's desire to, he didn't think he had any way. His term expires in a year. He didn't see any likelihood of his continuing in power beyond next year if he had continued with the national government. Mahinda Rajapaksa has been eager to get back into power as quickly as possible. I think partly because he's like any politician, he wants to be in power, but also I think he was worried about some of the corruption cases that were percolating slowly, but they were getting through the court system. And he was worried maybe in next year something would come of those. And I think it's also about, as Sirisena has himself articulated, it's about deep disagreements, cultural, psychological, political, economic, between him and the Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe. And I think there, both sides really completely misplayed their hand. And, there's mistakes on both sides. So I think Ranil Wickremesinghe and the UNP are probably close to 50% responsible for this crisis, although Sirisena was the one who, so to speak, pulled the trigger.
That's 50% responsible. Delan Madhavan, what is the disagreement about? What is the disagreement about over policy, over people?
There is most of the people in Sri Lanka are quite upset about what happened, because it's seen by most of the civil society members, of course, partisans of Wickremesinghe, but also academics, as a constitutional coup, mainly to protect the interest of Sirisena.
The president claims that there was an assassination attempt against him.
Yeah, but this plot is not really clear. So he seems to criticize one member of the cabinet, but there is not really any proof. And even if you had this issue, it should be solved in a trial in a court, not by sacking the prime minister. So it's not really clear. And the idea is also you have different scale of interpretation, and the role of China and India economically is very important too, I think.
We're going to get back to the role of outside players later. Bharat Gopalaswamy, your thoughts on what this constitutional crisis is really all about?
I think my colleague from London summarized some of these things eloquently. I think, first of all, I'm not a constitutional lawyer nor a constitutional expert per se, but whatever I've read and interpreted and understood, as per the constitutional amendment of the 19th constitutional amendment, I think this is illegal. And I also believe, and my interpretation, my understanding is the speaker has the right to dissolve the parliament or dismiss the prime minister, not the president per se. And I think this was designed in such a way so that to uphold the integrity of the democratic process. Now, coming to where the motivation of this crisis is, I understand that the Sirisena Ranil Wickremesinghe government has suffered a popularity decline. It's been hugely unpopular. It has failed to implement on the reforms that it had promised for people. And Mahinda Rajapaksa, as witnessed, was gaining in popularity as in the recent council elections and the local elections. So all this put together, Sirisena, like any other politician, saw the writing on the wall. It was a calculated political move to join forces and get back to retain his power. This was one option where he could just go back to Rajapaksa, forge a coalition, and keep him himself in power and dump Ranil.
Were you surprised?
I'm surprised. I knew something along these lines were coming, but I was surprised at the scale and the magnitude and the style in something this was done. But witnessing politics across subcontinent, I suspect one should never be surprised at such developments. But all that said and done, I think Sri Lanka has a credit of one of the oldest democracies in Asia, and I think it's a little bit disappointing to see things go this way.
A little bit disappointing, you say. Of course, we're going to see how it plays out when Parliament eventually does reconvene. I want to get back to that point. Mohan Wijewikrama, why not reconvene Parliament next week?
You must understand that the marriage between Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe at the start was to oust Rajapaksas from political stage. And that was the main reason for their getting together. But their policies never, resonated. And that was the main reason during the last 3.5 years, there were a lot of conflicts between the Prime Minister and the President. Now, to get back to your point, when a new government is formed, new Prime Minister is appointed, they are not going to pursue the same policies of the previous government. Ministers have to be appointed, they have to be given their tasks, new budget is around the corner, that has to be prepared. So there's a lot of things which needs to be done before the Parliament assembles. So that is the main reason why the Parliament has been prorogued for 2 or 3 weeks, which is absolutely legal, because the Constitution says that the President can prorogue it up to a time of 2 months. But he has prorogued it only for 3 weeks. If he wants, he can advance it by another proclamation. It all depends whether he can get everything in order, get the budget all prepared, so that when the Parliament assembles, that he can go on with the normal work of the Parliament.
Because cynics, let me just interrupt you here. Cynics are saying that the reason he refuses to recall Parliament sooner rather than later, or had refused, was because he wanted to win over as many lawmakers as possible that are caught in the middle, to have an extra week of lobbying. Your reaction to that claim?
Yeah, that is the general talk by the opposition, but that is not exactly the situation, because the situation by Mahinda Rajapaksa and the government has been that they have to get the budget prepared. And budget is the most important thing, because by December, it has to be approved so that the country to go forward. So budget was the main criteria to get this extended.
Alan Keenan, your thoughts?
Well, you might see from my face that I'm a wee bit skeptical about that argument. I'm sure the UNP, I know the UNP was already working on their budget. So, if it's a question of the budget, they'd be happy to help out there. It's not about the budget. It's not about the need for ministers to get up to speed on their various portfolios. It's about buying more time so that Rajapaksa and Sirisena can woo enough people over to their side. And when they feel confident that they've got the 113 they need, then the button will be pushed, and a few days later, Parliament will be called into session. I think that's what everybody knows in Sri Lanka. Of course, Ranil Wickremesinghe and the UNP are also trying to woo their people and try to win over anyone from Sirisena and Rajapaksa's side. So, the tradition in Sri Lanka of buying politicians, buying the votes of MPs, is longstanding, as it is in other countries sometimes. So everyone knows what's happening, and there's absolutely no reason why Parliament had to be prorogued in the first place. Of course, it's true; it was in the constitutional rights of Sirisena to do so. So no one, I don't think, is challenging his right to have prorogued the Parliament. It's more about the sort of the morality or the ethics of doing so that's in question.
Dylan Madhavan?
I'm quite agree with Alan. Actually, it's really a question to gain time, because time is playing, I think, for Sirisena and Rajapaksa.
Can Sirisena win his bet?
Sorry?
Can Sirisena win his bet and have Rajapaksa as his prime minister?
Because there is this tradition also to try to buy the support of some deputy, some member of parliament. And even if we recall history in 2014, it was a surprise to see Sirisena leave Rajapaksa government and join actually Ranil Wickremesinghe to jointly.
So are you saying alliances come together and get undone purely for mercantile reasons?
For some, unfortunately, yes.
It's not a very positive view of Sri Lanka's democracy.
I think it can happen in many democracies, but history of Sri Lanka is like this. We just have to read the records or historians' books to see that, unfortunately, that often happened in Sri Lanka.
Bharat Gopalaswamy, you agree?
You see, I have again, with my colleague in London, I want to echo a couple of points. If your priority is to prepare the budget, think of myself in an organization where a budget meeting is coming up, and the last thing that I want to fire is a key member of my team before the budget meeting is coming up and prepare why shoot myself in the foot by precipitating a crisis. So I think I disagree with the argument that this is the time for the budget and all that stuff. The other thing is also the horse trading or buying cash, for, giving yourself enough time to buy those MPs to sway on your side. We've seen news reports, however speculative they may be. That theory should not be dismissed about potential Chinese cash doing the rounds to buy those MPs. And it's curious that the Chinese ambassador has gone and visited Rajapaksa and congratulated him. So when a crisis like this is unfolding, how do you have the ambassador of a foreign country going and congratulating?
Yeah, in the past days, China's embassy in Sri Lanka putting out a statement to deny rumors it had paid lawmakers to endorse the ouster of Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. In its statement, saying such allegations are groundless and irresponsible. How do you respond, Mohan Wijewekrama, to these allegations that the Chinese might somehow be meddling?
So I think it has been denied by the Prime Minister. Former Prime Minister himself, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, was yesterday by some foreign journalist, and he categorically said that there's no Chinese involvement, so that we had to just write it off. And I must tell you that if anything is not legal, that is the removal of the Prime Minister, appointment of the Prime Minister, proroguing, we have a Supreme Court in Sri Lanka. And that is the place where people go for redress, to seek the legal remedies. Ranil Wickremesinghe, neither his party, has ever approached the Supreme Court. Now, this happened last Friday. Now, today is Wednesday here. So, last 5 days, they have not attempted to even seek the Supreme Court opinion on this. So, what I feel is that it is the wrong message that has been promulgated by certain vested people. I must tell you, when the parliament assembles, there is nothing called confidence vote. The parliament, if the parliament feels that there is no confidence against the Prime Minister who has been duly appointed, you have to bring a no confidence vote against him.
All right,
and
so
that is a procedure where the MPs sign and it has been handed over, it has to be the party leaders debated and the vote taken. And we'll say, for instance, Mahinda Rajapaksa loses that vote, it is not a confidence vote for Ranil Wickremesinghe. Because the president can again appoint a prime minister whom he feel enjoys the support of the parliament. That is the constitution. So you must understand the legal aspect.
All right,
And
we're gonna pick up on those legal aspects, and we're also going to pick up. I'm sorry to interrupt. We have to take a very quick break. We're going to pick up on those legal aspects and the role of China. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're watching the constitutional crisis that's unfolding in Sri Lanka. Joining us to talk about it from Colombo, Mohan Wijewekrama, former governor of Eastern Province, who is with us. Welcome back as well. From Washington, D.C., Bharat Gopalaswamy, director of the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. From London, we're in the company of Alan Keenan, Sri Lanka Project Director at Crisis Group, and here in the studio, Delon Madhavan, geographer and a research associate at the Center for Studies on India and South Asia. Yeah, the country divided and on tenterhooks. We saw one protester killed over the weekend after that surprise sacking of the PM, and there are big protests like the ones that took place in the capital on Tuesday.
President violated my civic right. He violated my constitution. He did something so unbecoming of us. We are not fools. I don't want him to insult my intelligence.
The trust has been betrayed. The trust that we placed in the government has been betrayed. The people that we elected to be our voice in parliament has no voice now.
And as we were saying in part one of our discussion, among the things that are weighing on this crisis are the role of regional players. Now, back in 2014, when Rajapaksa was president, his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping visited for the launch of a Chinese-funded $1.4 billion port city. There is Hambantota Port located at the southern tip of Sri Lanka. Hambantota, which happens to be Rajapaksa's home district. I want to get back to what you were talking about, Delon Madhavan, in part one of our discussion about the outsized role of China. Are we fixating too much on China and on these big projects like that one?
Yeah, but what is interesting also, it's just 1 week before actually the beginning of this crisis. Wickremesinghe was in New Delhi with Modi actually, and he withdrew a project which was given to China to give it in a joint venture with India and Sri Lanka. So I think all these considerations are also important because clearly Wickremesinghe seems closer to India, whereas Rajapaksa really seems close to China. And with all this trap economy, debt policy, etc., there is also a fear of it.
So is it a case of India supports one side and China supports the other?
It seems clear, I think, that for India it's better to not have Rajapaksa and his allies in Colombo.
Bharat Gopalaswamy, Sri Lanka, which is corresponding to a pattern we've seen in other places like Malaysia, like the Maldives, of blowback against China.
Yeah, I think there is a broader trend out here. You mentioned Malaysia, you mentioned Maldives. There is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The reality is China has been engaged in what Secretary Tillerson put it as predatory economics and also coercive lending practices, and traps most of these countries in a debt trap. And Sri Lanka is part of that debt trap. And I think the policymakers in Delhi and Washington are very wary about this. They are very concerned about this. And I think the United States' administration's policy vis-a-vis China, the reality is we are yet to come up with a viable alternative to offer to Sri Lanka in terms of development financing that provides a suitable alternative to Sri Lanka. And unless and until policymakers in Washington are able to offer that suitable alternative, you're going to have these kinds of incidents happening across Maldives or Sri Lanka or any other islands that China can get its hold on.
Yeah, the case in particular of the Hambantota Port is raising eyebrows because, well, the port has not so far met its promise. Some are calling it one of the world's biggest white elephants. Is that exaggerated?
No, I don't think that's exaggerated. I think the numbers are there to see, and there is a pattern to China's projects across, even in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. There are a number of these white elephant projects. In Africa, you've seen some of these white elephant projects. So I don't think it's exaggerated. You see, the bigger point here is also many of these financing by China they lack transparency. There are quality control issues. The scrutiny about them in the parliament is not so strict. And overall, even China's numbers themselves suffer lack of transparency issues. So when you have, this is why you're called a white elephant projects. And it behooves upon China to come up with more transparency in their lending practices, the numbers and what the results these projects kind of yield that support what their objectives are. And most of them have, beyond their economic angle, they have a security angle. Why pick projects like these that are security and strategic concerns to the neighboring nations if you're serious about building up a nation?
It makes sense, though, to build a port in Sri Lanka if you have big tankers that are going from the Far East towards Africa.
Yeah, no, I agree, but it's also a strategic. The thing with the Hambantota, there is a duality nature to this, right? There is not only an economic sense to this, but there is a duality nature. And if you look at China's projects across the Indian Ocean, they all have a duality nature to something like this.
Mohan Wickremesinghe, in the 5-year period when Rajapaksa was still president from 2010 to 2015, Sri Lanka's debt tripled in size proportional to GDP. Do you feel as though Sri Lanka got had by China?
First of all, I must just do some clarification on those figures. The Chinese loans amount only 10% of our overall debt. And that has been very, very announced. Chinese themselves has come up and said that you loan only 10% of your total loans. So we don't have a Chinese debt trap in Sri Lanka, number one. Number two, we just discussed about Modi, Prime Minister Modi of India. I mean, President Mahinda Rajapaksa also visited him recently, and they had a very cordial discussion. I mean, whatever the reservations they had, I think is all gone now, because he always have been telling that the Indians are my relations and all others are friends. I mean, we have been always treating Indians as relations. And do you know that Hambantota Port was never given to Chinese by Mahinda Rajapaksa, but it was given to Chinese by Ranil Wickremesinghe. And even this 50,000 houses, which came as a result of Indian grant, was given to a Chinese contractor by Ranil Wickremesinghe, and he was admonished and told to give it to Indians. So if you look at Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe, although that you are trying to portray that Mahinda Rajapaksa is anti-Indian, he is not. I mean, he is Sri Lankan. He loves Sri Lanka. And why Hambantota Port was located there? Because we saw Sri Lanka's only advantages are geography. And we must take advantage of geography, shipping, air, and whatnot, which is connected to geography. There are 100,000s of ships which pass us every year. Singapore attracts 100,000 ships, and we have been attracting only 100,000 ships, and Hambantota Port was never completed. By the time the regime changed from Rajapaksa to Ranil Wickremesinghe, only the, the part one, the first part was completed. Even the cranes are not installed. So how can a port bring you revenue when it is not completed? But given the chance, if you can renegotiate it, get it back, I don't know, we will run it, and it will be one of the ports which will bring a lot of revenue to Sri Lanka.
Hindsight being 2020, Alan Keenan, what's your takeaway on the Hambantota Port project?
Well, I mean, one interesting fact is that it was initially offered to India by Rajapaksa himself, and they didn't see it as a moneymaker. So then they went to China, which probably didn't see it as a moneymaker either, but saw that it would give them leverage. And some people think they have military intentions. I'm not sure. No one knows. But certainly they saw that even if they lost money on it, it might come back to benefit them. And I think my colleague in Washington's point, I think, is useful, that the U.S. and the West more generally hasn't figured out a way to compete with China's big they have all of this cash, and they can do a lot with the cash, and and the U.S. prefers to build, warships and new nuclear missiles, and maybe some of that money might be better used helping out countries like Sri Lanka. But in any case, I think it's not a simple China on Rajapaksa's side, India on Wickremesinghe's side. I think it's important not to see it as too black and white. In fact, India has been cultivating ties again with Rajapaksa, partly, to hedge their bets. So they think, well, this government, a few weeks ago, they'd say this government, the UNP coalition with Sirisena, is not doing too well. Rajapaksa and his people are coming back. They're much more popular. They're likely to win the next election. So we've got to be friends with Rajapaksa if he's going to be in power again. So, and other countries, I'm sure, are hedging their bets as well.
India,
And
let me just,
these, the way I think.
I just wanted to ask you, Alan Keenan, because just to explain for our viewers, India wary of China and what's called encirclement, because China does have growing influence in cash-strapped Pakistan, as well as influence in Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal. We can show it on the map here. Would you say today, Alan Keenan, that in India there's more of an obsession with China than with Pakistan?
Well, I'm not an expert in Indian politics, but certainly those concerns are very real. They're across the political spectrum in India, so that's real. I mean, my view is that if you look at Sri Lanka, I think countries like India in particular, but other countries, would actually have more influence if they followed, if they were really deep and principled supporters of democratic politics and of, constitutional and rule of law issues. And I think that would be true of the United States. I think if countries like the United States, India, et cetera, play on the same kind of pure power principles or lack of principles that China does, they're going to lose. But if they want to sort of weaken the ability or sort of temper the ability of China to gain influence around the world, and including in places like Sri Lanka, I think they would be better to be consistent defenders of democracy and liberal values. And I don't think they have been so clearly as they could have been.
Bharat Gopalaswamy, that brings us back to the current crisis at hand. How do you think India and the United States are going to be reacting?
Yeah, I also want to take the opportunity to second both my colleagues' point in Colombo as well as in London. I don't think it's as black and white as in India, China, or a United States vying for influence here. The picture in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, or however you want to term the geography, is much more complicated. For example, even India, for that matter, has a very robust trade relationship with China of around $80 to $90 billion. So there is all these countries have an equation amongst themselves, have a relationship with China, and they see China as the locomotive for their future growth. But at the same time, they've always looked up to the United States as a guarantor of stability on the security terms. So the American presence and the American stability in that region has always been that constant factor. And now what's happening in the last 10 years, as we witnessed with the Obama administration's rebalance or pivot to Asia or whatever you might have, whatever was there, and with the Secretary Tillerson laying out that speech on Indo-Pacific and the United States pursuing a policy of Indo-Pacific, what's aggravated the situation is the current political crisis in Washington itself, the whole America First thing, and the America, what does America First actually mean? America First does actually mean America alone. So all these mixed policy signals, the president's Twitter foreign policy has caused this flutter and alarm about where America actually stands. And I think that's where you've had an opportunity where China has pushed the status quo in many of these countries and watched and waited for the regional parties or the United States to respond. And when it has been unable to respond, or when it has not been able to not respond at all, China has taken those chances. So I think that's where the United States currently stands. I think the cutting of USAID funding was a bad signal sent to Sri Lanka. The United States has pressed on the human rights and the reconciliation efforts. I think that's a great move, but that is the only foot in which the United States led. That coupled with a viable development alternative, financing initiatives, mutual U.S.-Sri Lanka bilateral relations, all these should be positive foreign policy steps that the United States administration should have. Very recently, we have Ambassador Alana Teplitz, who has taken charge in Sri Lanka, and I'm hopeful that she will be able to fulfill all this vision and implement all these foreign policy objectives that we have.
It's not just India and the United States paying close attention to what's happening in Sri Lanka. I want to turn to the geographer in the room here. Devin, at the end of September, we saw Japan send its biggest warship, the Kaga helicopter carrier, into Sri Lanka's Colombo harbor. There were joint exercises. What did you make of that?
Oh, to tell the truth, I don't have any idea about it, actually.
But tell me about the strategic importance of Sri Lanka.
Actually, it's in the main road of commerce, actually, maritime commerce. So it's a strategical place. So I think for Japan, it's interesting to have exchanges with Sri Lanka and practice training with them to also consolidate their monitoring on this particular region.
Mahinda Rajapaksa, Rear Admiral Rajapaksa, were you surprised to see a Japanese vessel coming over for military exercises?
No, I think right along from our independence, we have been having exercises with many countries. And yes, this is the first time I think a large ship took part in the exercise. But I mean, friendly navies do exercises. We go to various other countries, our ships go. And that doesn't mean that, our policies have changed. We are basically non-aligned. We, are friendly with all the countries. We don't take sides. And any ship, whether it is China, India, Japan, Russia, UK, US, any ship can come and berth in our harbors for logistics and crew changes and so on. And even exercises.
I want to ask you as well, Mahinda Rajapaksa, when he was president, it was the period when there was the end of the civil war, which there was the crushing of the Tamil Tiger rebellion in the north, with an estimated 40,000 killed. There's been a process of reconciliation. Human rights activists say it's been timid. The fear is, if he returns back as prime minister, will that be the end of any type of truth and reconciliation process?
No, not at all. I think Sri Lanka has initiated its own mechanism for taking action against people who have, had war crimes. But this 40,000 thing is a bit of a fallacy, because you can't hide 40,000 skeletons in Jaffna. And we have not got 40,000 names of the people who have got killed. Even Lord Nesby, from UK, categorically said, going through various messages which have been going up and down with the British High Commission and US Embassy, that the maximum amount of casualties, including LTT, cannot be anything more than 8,000. So this 40,000 thing is, I think it's all wrong. And we were very unfortunate for Ranil Wickremesinghe's government to readily go and accept that there had been 40,000 deaths, because there's absolutely no proof. How can you hide 40,000? You can even hide 40,000, 400, 4,000 bodies who had got killed. So there's not a single trace, no skeletons. From satellite, you can find out whether there are people who have died of that magnitude. So it is a lie. And we'll have to certainly take it up with whatever the countries in time to come with the next government to resolve that.
Alan Keenan, the prospects for long-term reconciliation, if Mahinda Rajapaksa is confirmed as prime minister, what are they?
In a word, bleak. I think even this government, which may now no longer be there, the sort of Ranil Sirisena alliance, they said they wanted to address these issues. They said they wanted to reorient the state in more inclusive ways. They said they wanted to deal with the legacy of the war, but it was quite lackluster. I mean, there were some in the administration who were trying their best, and some I have a lot of respect for, but there were not the strong, concise, concerted, clear messages from either the Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, or the President, saying Sri Lanka has to shift from being a principally Sinhala Buddhist country, as enshrined in its constitution, to a pluralist country in which Tamils and Muslims are full and equal citizens. That hasn't happened. There's been no work really done consistently along those lines. And I think with Rajapaksa, there will absolutely be none of that work. So it's quite disappointing that this real window of opportunity that we've had the last 3 years has not really been made use of. And one last thing I'd like to add in the time we have is, it's not just about past issues, past violence, past deaths, but there's real worries that many activists, Tamil activists in the northern and eastern provinces, but also Muslims and Sinhalese, lawyers, journalists who have taken risks, who have challenged the Rajapaksas, who have investigated or called for the investigation of cases that possibly implicate the Rajapaksa family. Those guys are all going to be at risk. They're increasing worries about their risk to arrest, to intimidation, or possibly to physical violence. So I think the international community has to keep its eye on that issue very closely.
Dylan Madhavan?
Yeah, I'm quite worried for the issue of accountability. One of the hope when this Sri Lankan Wickremesinghe government was elected was they will try to set up some trial and give justice. I think minorities and civil societies are quite disappointed by the results, and of course, if Rajapaksa comes back to the power, it's clearly sure that nothing will happen again. And the other problem is really the security of the civil society members and minorities. Actually, you had for the past years a lot of violence against Muslim people. So what will happen? And the thing is, when Rajapaksa was set in power again as prime minister, the first move was to attack the media, actually, run by the government. So
we're gonna talk about that in our Media Watch segment. I want to thank you, Delon Medavan. I want to thank Mohan Wijewikrama for being with us from Colombo. I also want to thank Alan Keenan in London and Bharat Gopalaswamy for being with us from Washington.